everyone. Wishing you a good Erev Shabbos Kodesh. Hope this message finds you well. As we give our YouTube drasha, this Devar Torah for this week, let's take a look at our Sedra, Parshas Toldot, as our history changes in a moment. In this moment in which our patriarch Yaakov Avinu, receives the blessing, the all-important blessing from his father Yitzchak. One has to ask a question. Why is it that Yaakov had to resort to trickery? Why is it that Rivka had to plot against Yitzchak's best wishes and instincts? Why is it that the bracha went to the child who was born second, not first? Sure, there are different commentaries that Yaakov was conceived first, that Esav, of course, sold his right, as we know. It's important for us to know we rightfully came about his blessing by way of our ancestor Yaakov. But let us ask the all-important question: why didn't Yitzchak see things the way Rivka saw them? Why didn't they agree as to who would carry the baton, as to who would lead the Jewish people and the family and the ideology of the family going forward? Why didn't Rivka and Yitzchak agree? And for that, we turn to the commentary of the Netziv. The Netziv of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, my favorite modern commentator, I would say. My favorite modern commentary. 19th century from Lithuania. He was the head of yeshiva in Volozhin, the most important yeshiva, arguably, of the 1800s, and we would not be where we are today without that yeshiva. I strongly recommend reading up on the history of the Netziv, the history of the Volozhin yeshiva, and pick up a copy of the biography out of print called My Uncle the Netziv. So the Netziv's commentary is extraordinary. In fact, his commentary for Parshas Toldot, which captures this moment in our history with such great color, with such great understanding. It actually is found in last week's Parsha. And he said it all stems from the initial meeting, the meeting between Yitzchak and Rivka for the very first time. She sees the man in the field. She asks Eliezer, who is this man? He says it is Yitzchak. The verse tells us she covers herself. And this is where it gets interesting. The Netziv says, why is she covering herself? Merov pachad ubusha, he says. Out of great fear, out of great embarrassment. After all, she was raised in an uncivilized, relatively depraved, idolatrous family without the scruples, without the manners and the ethics, the morality of the house of Avram and Sarah. This affected her and her decision-making for all time. She recognized that she wasn't worthy, in a certain sense, in her mind, to be the wife of Yitzchak. And from this point onward, he says, Me'az v'hala nikva b'liba pachad mimenu. She had a certain kind of fear, trepidation from her husband, from her life partner. V'lo haisei Yitzchak kemo Sarah im Avraham, v'Rachel im Yaakov. She was not with Yitzchak on the same plane like Sarah and Avraham were, like our matriarch and patriarch Rachel and Yaakov, he explains. If they had an issue, he says, they had a kepeda. You know what happened? Sarah would march right up to Avram and say what was on her mind. And Rachel would do the same, but not Rivka. Rivka was different. Their relationship was different. Masha Enken Rivka. And this is the key to understanding the strange episode of Yaakov dressing up and Rivka plotting to take the blessing with Yaakov's trickery. He says, Kol zeh hakdama lasipor sheyavo. This initial meeting between Yaakov, between Yitzchak and Rivka, is our introduction to understand what took place so many years later. when their marriage was already in the middle of their parenting efforts. Rivka didn't find the heart to stand up to Yitzchak and to share her thoughts about which child should be groomed, should be trained to carry the leadership for what would become the Jewish people. She didn't have the guts to say, the Netziv explains, that Esav was a hunter. He was a very material human being. She never protested this prioritization of Esav by Yitzchak. And so too, he explains, V'chein b'shas habrachos, when it came to the actual blessings at the end of Yitzchak's life. Even to that point, ad kedei kach, she did not say anything explicitly to her husband. The Netziv explains that this was all part of Hashem's plan. After all, look what happened. Everything turned out really well. Everything turned out the way it was supposed to. We don't often understand why things happen, but Yaakov received the blessing. He made certain life decisions accordingly, and you and I are here today to tell the tale because of what transpired. And he explains, if Rivka was a woman like the other matriarchs, in terms of their relationship, he says none of this would have happened. You and I wouldn't be here. Hakol b'hashgacha pratis, the divine providence of our people, divine providence that rested upon this situation. And eventually we see that indeed Rivka went out, that really the will of Hashem was to follow the thought process of Rivka, that Yitzchak needed to be prioritized the whole time, and eventually it transpired. So many messages to take from this. Perhaps most importantly, first and foremost, that our spiritual DNA is the Chumash, is the Torah. Most importantly, is what does it mean? The verse in Parshas Chayei Sarah and these psukim in Parshas Toldot. We need to understand each pasuk, each sentence, because it is our identity. And we understand now why she covered herself. We understand what that foreshadowed. But beyond that, there are other messages based on this commentary of the Netziv. Firstly, we see that Rivka's very humble beginnings, the very embarrassing upbringing that she had, relatively speaking, none of that stood in the way because the Almighty eventually chose her direction, her outlook as to what should take place. And just because Yitzchak came from this illustrious family and Rivka did not, didn't mean that Yitzchak had a monopoly on truth. We learn from this commentary that the Almighty chose the path of this great Jewish mother of Rivka. We also see from this commentary that a person needs to express what they feel discreetly, respectfully, but if you have an issue with something or with someone, don't keep it in. Rivka kept that inside. It's clear from this commentary that that's not the ideal. The ideal is to look at the other relationships that Yaakov had, that Avraham had. Now, of course, it was all part of a master plan, but we can never suppose that there's some sort of master plan. This wasn't necessarily healthy. And really, somebody needs to, in a private way, make sure that they say what's on their mind, not to hold back a relationship due to lack of communication, but in a way that's constructive, in a way that's productive, to raise any issues that need to be raised. And so we turn to our history and we see how Rivka was able to affect change within our history. We're grateful that Yaakov received the blessing of all blessings and that we didn't have Esav receive this blessing. And there's so much more to talk about, but the trajectory of who we are comes from this moment, understanding that, part of understanding who we are. So hopefully, as we all read through Parshas Toldot, Yirat Somei B'Hashem's will, that we see how it is that we became who we became, and we give credit in a sense for what took place, and we have a greater understanding of our Sedra this week. Thank you and have a wonderful Shabbos.